Lucas came on a Sunday with papers. Not for dinner, with papers. He called at noon and said, "Mom, I need to stop by. I have something I need you to look at." I said, "Come at 2." He arrived at 1:58. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and placed a folder in front of me. I said, "Coffee first." He said, "Mom, this is important." I said, "Coffee first, Lucas." I poured 2 cups. I sat down. I opened the folder. A power of attorney document, specific to real property, naming Lucas Brooks as the authorized agent for all decisions related to the property at Birchwood Lane and the Lake House property in Vermont. I read it once. Then I looked up. I said, "When did you prepare this?" He said, "Last week. I have been thinking about the future, and I think it makes sense to have a clear structure in place for the properties." I said, "A clear structure?" He said, "Just for efficiency, in case you are unavailable or—" I said, "In case I am unavailable." He said, "Or incapacitated. It is standard estate planning." I said, "Lucas." He said, "Yes." I said, "Look at the front door." He turned. He looked. He turned back. He said, "Those are different locks." I said, "Yes, I changed them yesterday." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because yesterday I found out you were coming today with papers. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher. Let me tell you how I found out. Daniel called me on Saturday morning. He was at Northeastern, first semester, 3rd month. He called at 8:47, which is early for a university student on a Saturday, and which told me before he spoke that something had happened that he felt could not wait until a reasonable hour. He said, "Grandma, I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I was home last weekend. Dad had some people over on Friday evening, business colleagues. I was in my room, and I could hear the conversation in the living room." He stopped. I said, "What did you hear?" He said, "Dad was talking about the properties, Birchwood Lane and the Lake House. He said he was getting a power of attorney document prepared. He said he was going to bring it to you on Sunday, and that he thought you would sign it without reading it carefully, because you trusted him." I sat with that sentence. Because you trusted him. Daniel said, "Grandma, I am sorry. I did not know whether to call you." I said, "You did exactly the right thing." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am going to be fine. Thank you for calling me." He said, "Grandma." He also said, he stopped. I said, "Tell me everything." He said Nicole had found a property management company, that once he had the power of attorney, they could list both properties for long-term lease. That the income would solve their financial problems. Long-term lease. Birchwood Lane, my house, where I live, listed for long-term lease. I said, "Daniel, this conversation stays between us for now." He said, "Yes." I said, "Go back to your Saturday. Take good photographs." He said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have been sending you photographs from my first month at Northeastern." I said, "Yes, they are extraordinary." He said, "The one I sent on Tuesday, the library window at 6 in the morning." I said, "It is on my refrigerator next to the boarding pass photograph." He said, "Okay." He said, "I just wanted to make sure you knew." He hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about the pattern. The loans, the lake house nearly sold, Vermont, the medical letter, the wedding, the guardianship letter, and now this. Each time I had been ahead of it. Each time by a smaller margin, because the attempts had been escalating, and now Lucas was coming on Sunday with a power of attorney document and the belief that I would sign it without reading carefully because I trusted him. I called Patricia at 9:15. She said, "I have been expecting your call." I said, "Daniel?" She said, "Daniel called me first. He said he was not sure if he should call you directly. I told him to call you." I said, "Good." She said, "The power of attorney." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Two things before Sunday." She said, "Tell me." I said, "First, I want a locksmith at Birchwood Lane today. New locks on every exterior door. The front door, the back door, the door to the garden. New keys. Only mine." She said, "I know someone reliable. He can be there by noon." I said, "Good." I said, "Second, I want the lake house deed reviewed this week. I want to confirm that the current ownership structure is airtight, that nothing can be leased or transferred without my direct written authorization." She said, "Margaret reviewed the lake house documents 6 months ago after the Vermont situation. They are airtight, but I will have her confirm again by tomorrow morning." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Eleanor, the power of attorney document. When Lucas brings it on Sunday." I said, "I know. Let him bring it." She said, "You are going to let him sit at your kitchen table and present it." I said, "Yes." She said, "With new locks on the door he does not yet know about." I said, "Yes." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then we have a conversation that is long overdue." The locksmith arrived at 11:47 on Saturday. He was thorough and efficient. By 1:15, every exterior door had new locks. I had 3 sets of new keys, one in my bag, one in Patricia's office, one in my kitchen drawer. None for Lucas. Not yet. If you have ever found out that someone was coming to take something from you and had one day to prepare, stay with me, because what Lucas's face looked like when he saw those locks is something I want you to hear. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. Lucas looked at the locks for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "You knew I was coming." I said, "I knew you were coming with papers, yes." He said, "How?" I said, "I have good sources." He said, "Daniel." I said, "I am not going to tell you who told me. What matters is that I was told, and that what I was told was accurate." He looked at the folder on the table between us. He said, "Mom, this is not what you think it is." I said, "Tell me what it is." He said, "It is a standard power of attorney for property management, estate planning, efficient structure for the future." I said, "Read me the scope clause, page 2, third paragraph." He opened the folder. He found the clause. He read it silently first, then he read it aloud. "The authorized agent shall have full authority to lease, manage, modify, encumber, or otherwise administer all real property held in the name of Eleanor Ann Brooks, including, but not limited to, the property at Birchwood Lane, Connecticut, and the lake property in Vermont, for any period and under any terms the agent deems appropriate, without further authorization from the principal." He finished reading. He closed the folder. He said, "I did not draft this myself." I said, "No, an attorney drafted it, but you brought it here. You told your colleagues on Friday evening that I would sign it without reading it carefully." He said nothing. I said, "Because I trusted you." He looked at the table. I said, "Those were your words, Lucas, not mine." He said, "Mom." I said, "I want you to understand something before we go any further." He looked up. I said, "If you had come to me last week and said, 'Mom, Nicole and I are in serious financial difficulty. We need help. I want to talk to you about the properties and what might be possible,' I would have had that conversation with you, honestly, with Patricia present, with accurate numbers. I would have listened." He said, "I did not think you would help." I said, "After 21 years of helping you, you did not think I would help." He said, "After the guardianship letter, after Vermont, after everything, I thought you were done." I said, "I am not done. I am watching. Those are different things." He said, "The properties, long-term lease." I said, "Yes, a property management company Nicole found. Both properties. the income to address your financial problems. He said, you know about all of it. I said, yes. He said, I am sorry. I said, I know. I said, Lucas, tell me about the financial situation, the real version. He said, the business is struggling. The partnership with Gregory has not recovered fully since the LLC situation. We have 3 projects that stalled. The cash flow has been difficult for 8 months. I said, how difficult? He said, we are behind on the mortgage. Not significantly, but behind. I said, how far behind? He said, 2 months. I said, 2 months. And the solution you arrived at was a power of attorney giving you authority to lease my home without my consent. He said, Nicole found the property management company. She said the income from both properties could solve everything within 6 months. She said getting the power of attorney was just an administrative step. I said, just an administrative step. I said, to lease the house where I live. He said, I told her it was wrong. I said, did you? He said, I told her 3 days ago that I was not going to do it, that I would come and talk to you instead. I said, but you still came with the papers. He said, I brought them to show you what she had prepared, not to ask you to sign. I looked at my son, 38 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a power of attorney document he said he had come to show rather than to present. I said, Lucas, which is true? Did you come to ask me to sign or to show me what Nicole prepared? He was quiet for a long moment. He said, I do not know. I got in the car with the folder, and I drove here, and I was not certain until I walked in the door what I was going to do. That was the most honest thing he had said in a long time. I said, and when you saw the locks? He said, when I saw the locks, I knew you already knew. And I felt something I cannot fully describe. I said, tell me what you can describe. He said, relief. I said, relief? He said, yes, because if you already knew, then I did not have to decide. The decision had already been made for me. I looked at him. I said, that is a very honest answer. He said, I have been trying to be more honest. I said, I know, you have been, imperfectly, but trying. He said, the locks? I said, yes. He said, I do not have a key. I said, no. He said, will I get one? I said, that depends on what happens next. If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever had someone tell you they were doing something for your benefit while planning to take something from you, leave me a comment. Tell me what happened. I read every single one. I reached into the folder beside my chair. 1 document, single page. I placed it on the table. Lucas looked at it. It was not a legal instrument. It was a letter, my handwriting. He said, what is this? I said, read it. He read. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, I am aware of the financial difficulty you and Nicole are currently facing. I have been aware for 6 weeks. Margaret monitors certain indicators that become visible when a household in my family is under significant financial pressure. The 2-month mortgage arrears. The paused contributions to James's education fund. The 3 stalled projects. Lucas looked up. I said, keep reading. He looked back down. The second paragraph said, I have spoken with Patricia and Margaret about options. There is a structure available that could address the immediate difficulty without requiring any transaction involving my properties. A short-term family loan, fixed rate, formal documentation, monthly repayments beginning in 90 days to allow stabilization. The amount sufficient to clear the mortgage arrears and provide 3 months of operational cash flow for the business. He stopped reading again. He said, Mom! I said, 3rd paragraph. He read. The 3rd paragraph said, this offer is available if you come to me directly and honestly with the full picture. It is not available if you come to me with a power of attorney document. It is not available if Nicole presents it as a solution without your knowledge. It is available if you sit at my kitchen table and tell me the truth. He set the letter down. He said, "You were going to offer this." I said, "Yes." He said, "Before I brought the folder." I said, "The letter has been written for 2 weeks, since Margaret flagged the mortgage situation." He said, 2 weeks. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you waited." I said, "I waited to see how you would come to me, whether you would come honestly or whether you would come with papers." He said, "And I came with papers." I said, "You came with papers and new locks on the door, and a son at Northeastern who called me on a Saturday morning at 8:47 because he was not ready to let you make this mistake without giving me the chance to be ready." He said, "Daniel." I said, "Daniel has been sending me photographs from Northeastern for 3 months, library windows at 6 in the morning. He called me on a Saturday because that is what the people in my life do. They call me." He said nothing. I said, "The offer in the letter still stands." He looked up. I said, "You came with the folder. You showed me the locks were changed, and you felt relief. That is not the same as coming to deceive me. You were uncertain. You told me honestly that you did not know until you walked in the door what you were going to do." He said, "I should have called you 2 months ago." I said, "Yes." He said, "When the mortgage first fell behind." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was ashamed." I said, "I know. You are always ashamed before you are honest. That is the pattern. The loans, the lake house, the wedding, the guardianship letter. Each time the shame comes before the truth." He said, "How do I change that?" I said, "You call me when the shame first arrives, before it becomes something worse." He said, "What if you say no?" I said, "Then I say no, and we figure out a different path, together, but honestly." He said, "What if the honest answer is that we have needed help for a long time, and I have been too proud to ask for it?" I said, "Then that is the honest answer, and it is a better starting place than a power of attorney document on a Sunday afternoon." He said, "Yes." He said, "The offer in the letter." I said, "Yes." He said, "Patricia has the documentation ready." I said, "Patricia has had it ready for 2 weeks." He said, "Of course she has." He said, "And Nicole?" I said, "Nicole is not here today. This conversation is between you and me." He said, "She will need to know." I said, "Yes. You will tell her tonight. All of it. The letter, the offer, the new locks, Daniel." He said, "She will not be pleased about Daniel." I said, "That is between you and Nicole. Daniel made a choice to protect someone he loves. I will not apologize for his choice or mine." He said, "Okay." He said, "Mom, the locks." I said, "Yes." He said, "When do I get a key?" I said, "When you sign the documentation with Patricia, and when you come the following Sunday for dinner, not with papers, just for dinner." He said, "That is 2 weeks." I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." He said, "The power of attorney document." I said, "Leave it on the table." He left it. I picked it up after he stood. I tore it in half. I placed both halves in the folder and set it beside my chair. Lucas watched this. He said, "You could have just said no." I said, "I could have, but tearing it is clearer." He almost smiled. He said, "I will call Patricia tomorrow." I said, "She is expecting your call." He stood at the door for a moment, the new locks visible. He said, "Grandma, when Daniel called you, what did you think?" I said, "I thought that a boy who sends photographs of library windows at 6 in the morning and calls his grandmother on a Saturday because he is not ready to let her be deceived is exactly the kind of person I hoped he would become." He said, "You hoped?" I said, "I always hoped. That is what grandmothers do." He said, "Even when the hoping takes a long time." I said, "Especially then." He left. I locked the new locks behind him. Then I went to the kitchen and I made fresh coffee, and I sat at the table and I looked at the torn power of attorney document in the folder beside my chair. Then I looked at my phone. I found Daniel's most recent photograph. The library window, 6 in the morning. Light coming through glass at an angle that made the whole room look like something worth keeping. I put my phone down. I thought, yes, exactly that. It is Monday morning. Lucas called Patricia at 9:03. Patricia texted me at 9:07. She said, "He called. Full picture. Everything you described. He wants to move forward with the loan structure." I wrote back, "Schedule it for Wednesday." She wrote, "Done." Daniel texted at 10. He said, "Grandma, did he come?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And?" I said, "He left without the power of attorney and with the offer in the letter." He said, "You had the letter ready." I said, "I had it ready for 2 weeks." He said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes." He said, "You knew he was going to come with papers." I said, "I knew he might. I prepared for the possibility." He said, "But you also had the offer ready." I said, "Yes, both things simultaneously. The preparation for what might go wrong and the offer for what could go right." He said, "That is—" He stopped. He said, "That is extraordinary." I said, "It is Thursday morning, Daniel. Ordinary. Clear. Exactly as it should be." He said, "It is Monday." I said, "Yes, the principle applies on Mondays too." He sent a photograph 20 minutes later. His dormitory window, early light, a coffee cup on the windowsill. His caption said, "Monday morning. Ordinary. Clear." I put it on my refrigerator, next to the boarding pass, next to the library window at 6 in the morning, a power of attorney document torn in half in a folder beside my chair, new locks on every door, an offer letter written 2 weeks before it was needed, a grandson who called on a Saturday at 8:47, and Monday morning arriving exactly as it should. Ordinary, clear, with new locks and old coffee and the particular quiet of a house that has never been for sale and never will be. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever come to your door with papers and left without them? Tell me what happened when you were ready before they arrived. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe.